So hello, everybody. Welcome to our keynote. And just a quick technical review of sort of how everything's going to work. We're doing roughly 20 minutes of presentation, 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions over the course of the presentation, put the question in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And then when we get to the Q&A, I'll sort of MC the whole thing, and I'll be asking Rebecca the questions. We will see with that, I guess we might as well just get started. Rebecca is the host of the Tudors Dynasty podcast, and let's take it from there.
Wow. Thank you so much to the coordinators of the Intelligent Speech Conference for inviting me here today. And thank you to all of you who are joining me. So as Ben said, I'm Rebecca Larson. I am the founder and the host of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. And today I will be discussing the Tudors and their contingency plans. So I hope you're ready for some heavy history this morning, because there's a lot to cover. So to start, what is a contingency? Well, the word contingency means a provision for an unforeseen event or circumstance. Now, okay, that term is broad and it spans many topics, but none more so than the royal family and their line of succession. The Tudor dynasty is one of the most iconic royal bloodlines in history, and they navigated a tumultuous path in their relentless pursuit of power. Their determination to perpetuate their sovereignty ultimately unraveled under the weight of their own ambition. Their rule, spanning from 1485 to 1603, which is a duration of 118 years, carved an indelible mark on English history, heralding significant political, religious, and societal shifts. Now, this period is characterized by the reigns of Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, witnessed an era of unprecedented transformation. But how would they hold on to their power? Because that's the key. Margaret Beaufort was the mother of Henry Tudor, future Henry VII. And if you're familiar with the Tudors, you know that name. Elizabeth Woodville, who was the widow of Edward IV and mother of Elizabeth of York, these two women were both instrumental in uniting the two rival houses of York and Lancaster with the marriage of their children, which really was a contingency plan in its own right. Henry VII became the founder, Henry VII became the founder of the Tudor dynasty and established a stabilizing regime after the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses. His son, the infamous Henry VIII, is renowned for his break from the Roman Catholic Church, marking the beginning of the English Reformation, all of which one could argue was his contingency plan for an heir. Following Henry VIII's death, his young son, Edward VI, ascended to the throne. Despite his brief reign, Edward's rule significantly advanced Protestant reforms. However, the instability of his health and his premature death prevented him from fully shaping England's future. So upon his death, a contingency plan was put into place, and her name was Lady Jane Grey. Subsequently, Mary I's reign attempted to restore Catholicism. She married well to Philip II of Spain, but could not produce an heir. The zenith of the Tudor dynasty was embodied in the reign of Elizabeth I. Her era, known as the Elizabethan Age, was marked by a blossoming of culture, literature, and maritime exploration. Elizabeth's astute governess, diplomatic prowess, and unwavering leadership not only solidified England's position on the global stage, but also steered the nation through domestic and international challenges. Elizabeth never married, but did she have a contingency plan in place? Amidst the accomplishments of the Tudor monarchs lay the strategic maneuvers and contingency plans they employed to navigate the intricate and often treacherous currents of their time. Their ability to adapt to the shifting political and religious landscapes while retaining a firm grip on power characterized their rule. The Tudor dynasty's legacy remains a rich tapestry of political sagas, religious transformations, and societal evolutions. Their reign, despite its achievements, ultimately crumbled under the weight of internal and external pressures, serving as a cautionary tale of the perils that accompany unbridled ambition and the struggle to maintain supremacy over an ever-changing landscape. So today, this is a long way to get to this, we look at the Tudors and their contingency plans. Now, I've said this before, that the Tudors themselves were a contingency plan. After the Battle of the Wars of the Roses, the line of succession for both the Lancasters and the Yorks had been severely depleted. Margaret Beaufort, had she been born a man, would herself have been a viable claimant to the throne, with her family line going back to none other than John of Gaunt and his mistress or wife. This was Margaret's great-grandfather. But Margaret was a woman. And so when it appeared that all other claimants had either been killed in battle or murdered, Margaret sought to have her son protected and safe with his uncle Jasper Tudor. Now, if we fast forward to the year 1485, a significant year for anybody who knows the Tudors, this same Henry Tudor stepped foot back in England with an army of loyal men and mercenaries to defeat King Richard III and reclaim the throne of England for the Lancastrians. He was successful, and Richard III was the last king of England to be killed on the battlefield. But as I briefly alluded to, Henry's claim to the throne was weak and questionable, since it was through what some believe to be an illegitimate branch of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. But the argument today remains that they were legitimized by their cousin Richard II. What Margaret Beaufort understood, and what the widow of Edward IV understood, was that these battles for the throne of England would continue if they didn't act swiftly. By joining the warring houses of the Wars of the Roses, they would hopefully instill peace in the country. So the newly crowned King Henry VII of England married the Yorkist princess, daughter of the late Edward IV and niece of Richard III, to Henry VII. Now, this secured the throne because here we are combining those two houses. Their marriage and their subsequent children would instill peace in England. The king and queen had several children together, but the most important part of this newly formed dynasty was their sons, Arthur, the heir, and his younger brother, Henry, the spare. With these two boys, the Tudor dynasty was secure. Two surviving daughters, Margaret and Mary, would help form alliances with other rulers. And during his reign, Henry VII married his daughter Margaret to the King of Scots, James IV. The idea was to secure peace between the two neighboring countries and ultimately one throne. But the problem occurred in 1502, when Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, died prematurely. He had been married only months before to Catherine of Aragon, solidifying her parents, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, as powerful allies for England. But upon Arthur's death, a crisis occurred at Tudor court. All that remained was one son, Henry. And no longer having a spare to their heir, Elizabeth of York promised her husband, the king, that she would give him the spare that he so desperately needed. She quickly became pregnant, but died shortly after childbirth. And so did the child, a daughter. Henry VII would have no more sons. So in 1509, when he passed away, his only son, Henry, became Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII is one of the most famous and infamous kings in history. We know him best as the man who married 6 times but killed 2 of his wives, the man who formed and became the head of the Church of England, and he was the king of contingency plans. When Henry ascended the throne in 1509, his first course of action was to marry his dead brother's wife, Catherine of Aragon. Securing that alliance with Spain was appealing, but it also didn't hurt that he liked Catherine. They wed soon after, and by 1511, Catherine gave birth to a son, Henry, titled Duke of Cornwall. Henry was their heir. The couple were over the moon with excitement. Bonfires were lit in the streets, wine was handed out, and church bells rang, all in the announcement that England had its heir. But sadly, as happened quite often in those days, young Henry died at just 52 days old. But Henry and Catherine were still young, and they were hopeful that another son would soon grace the royal nursery. In 1514, Henry VIII and his advisors negotiated a marriage treaty with France, which included a marriage between his younger sister and his favorite sister and the elderly King Louis XII. Mary, a beautiful young woman of only 18, was not keen to marry such an old man. Imagine that. And got her brother to agree that she could marry whomever she wanted after the aged king died. Her marriage to Louis was brief, and many say the old king enjoyed the marital bed with his wife so much that it was the reason for his death only 3 months later. This left the door open for the now Dowager Queen, Mary, to marry the man of her choosing. But before she asked her brother for permission, she secretly married his best friend, Charles Brandon. This caused quite a scandal, and nearly 4 decades later, that marriage would cause another contingency plan that nobody could have foreseen. By 1515, Henry VIII had not yet produced a living son and heir, nor any living children for that matter. Henry sat on the throne for over 5 years. He was now about 23 years old. His wife, Catherine, was about 6 years his senior, and she was now 30 years old and was nearly at the end of her fertile years. But he had not yet put a contingency plan in place for her failure to provide. Because let's be honest, they saw it as her failure, not his. So this was a problem. Henry needed a male heir. But in a worst case scenario, at least he had a healthy daughter, Mary. After all, Catherine's mother, Isabella, ruled Castile in her own right. So it really wasn't unheard of. It just wasn't wildly accepted in England. In 1519, Henry VIII's mistress, Bessie Blount, became pregnant. And in June, she gave birth to a healthy son. The king named him Henry Fitzroy, meaning son of the king. By 1525, Queen Catherine had still not produced a son and heir. And so Henry, forming his own plan for the future, made little Henry Fitzroy a member of the prestigious Order of the Garter and made him Duke of Richmond and Somerset, both very generous titles. While there's no evidence to prove that Henry's plan was to make Fitzroy his heir, it's commonly acknowledged that this is what his intent was. But things would change. In the mid-1520s, Henry VIII saw a woman at court named Anne Boleyn. Anne was intriguing and maybe a beguiling figure to Henry. She was young, well, younger than his wife. She was well educated and had spent much time at French court, giving her a worldly appeal, much like Catherine of Aragon had. Henry fell in love with Anne, like head over heels, obsessed with her. He wanted to make her his mistress, but she would not agree. All she would agree to was marriage. But the king was already married. So what did Henry do? Well, he turned England on its head by declaring himself the head of the Church of England, just so he could divorce his wife of 2 decades and marry Anne Boleyn, the younger woman who promised him a son. So Henry and Anne got married in 1533. She gave birth to a daughter, right? A daughter, not the son that she had promised, and the son that Henry so desperately needed to secure the Tudor dynasty. They tried and tried, but Anne could not provide him with this son. But there was always Henry Fitzroy waiting in the wings. Eventually, Anne Boleyn became Henry's victim, and he had her executed in May 1536 on a multitude of trumped-up charges. Henry then married Jane Seymour less than 2 weeks later. But in July of that year, Henry Fitzroy suddenly died. And so Henry VIII was back at square one. He needed a son by Jane Seymour, and Jane's family had been full of sons. So the odds of her giving the king a son was great. She had 4 older brothers. Her mother had given birth to 4 sons, John, Edward, Henry, and Thomas, before Jane even came into the picture. So Jane Seymour as the choice of a 3rd bride made perfect sense to Henry. And in October 1537, she indeed provided Henry with the healthy male heir he so desired, Edward. But sadly, Jane died not long after childbirth, much like her mother-in-law 34 years earlier. But Henry had a son. Henry married 3 more times in hopes of another son, his spare, but it would not be. And so when he died in 1547, it was his son Edward, now Edward VI, who would have to secure the Tudor line. But Edward was just a boy of 9 years old, and he could not rule on his own. A regency council was formed of men to aid him in ruling until he reached his majority. But men grasp at power when it's within their reach, and Edward's rule was not as peaceful or secure as ambitious men. His uncle ruled as Lord Protector until he was removed by the ambitious John Dudley, Earl of Warwick. Warwick eventually made his power play after having Edward Seymour executed and looked to secure even more power for his own family. In May 1553, John Dudley's son, Guildford, was wed to Lady Jane Grey. Jane Grey, like I said, was the granddaughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, the younger sister of Henry VIII, whose children had been mentioned in his line of succession. Now, this is important because marrying someone in the line of succession required royal authority. And just over a month later, Edward VI wrote his device for succession, which was to override his father's 1543 Act of Succession. In 1543, it was approved by Parliament that if Edward would die childless, the throne would pass to his sister Mary. And should Mary die childless, then the throne would pass to Elizabeth. After Mary and Elizabeth came the children of Henry's favorite sister, Mary, and her children by Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Whether it was the influence of the president of the Regency Council, John Dudley, or Edward VI's desire for a Protestant England, the king named his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his successor. The only problem with this plan was that whomever it was not approved by Parliament. and so it did not have a legal standing. Eventually, Jane Grey, her husband, and his brother were all executed. And Henry VIII's daughter Mary, by Catherine of Aragon, became the first queen regnant of England. Mary didn't reign very long. She wed her cousin, Philip II of Spain, and worked toward returning England to Catholicism. But sadly, Mary would not be able to produce a child. And on her death, she was succeeded by her half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, as per their father's 1543 Act of Succession. Elizabeth had watched what had happened to her sister as the first queen regnant. She understood how having a man by her side could diminish the appearance of her power, so she did not marry. She did not have children that we know of, or did she? Officially, Elizabeth remained unmarried, despite various offers of marriage. There had been rumors that the queen had had Dudley's love child, but Elizabeth could not marry Robert Dudley. There's just too much scandal surrounding their relationship, and the fact that his wife had died under mysterious circumstances. Many believed he had ordered his wife's death, even though he was acquitted of any guilt by the coroner's court in August 1561. Finally, determined to have his own heir, Dudley betrayed the queen's love and married her younger cousin, Lettice Knowles, in 1579. Elizabeth named no heir, and in her father's will, it stated that if she had no heirs, that the throne would then pass to her Grey cousins. Lady Jane Grey was executed in 1554, but her sister, Catherine, was still alive. Unfortunately, Catherine had fallen in love and secretly married Edward Seymour, first cousin of Edward VI, and of course, without the Queen's permission, and both were thrown in the Tower of London. In the end, her cousin, James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, once Queen of Scotland from infancy, and Dowager Queen of France, granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Margaret Tudor, who had King James IV of Scotland, whose son, James V of Scotland, had married the French Mary of Guise, became James I of England, the descendant of the one line that Henry VIII specifically excluded from the 1543 Act of Succession, because Elizabeth never named her heir. The Tudors are one of the most fascinating and intriguing dynasties in royal history. And I hope you enjoyed today's talk about the Tudors and their contingency plans. And I hope you also agree with me that they really were the kings and queens of contingency.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions to get us going? I have something I can start us off with, but does anyone? Okay.
Hopefully everybody's not sleeping right now after that.
No. Robert, you raised your hand. Oh, I can let you talk. Yeah, everyone should post.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah.
My point was going to be about talking about the succession. Could you argue that it was the failure of the Tudors to adequately plan for the succession that led almost directly to the Civil War?
Oh, wow. That is an interesting.
Because you could argue that the Stuarts were probably among the least competent successors, and that perhaps, I realize this is supporting the whole great or not great man of history, but you could argue that it was the Stuarts themselves and the two kings that came out of that before the Civil War that led directly to the Civil War, because basically their own lack of suitability.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for bringing that. I guess I always think backwards, and I think to the Plantagenets and what happened there and how the Plantagenets kind of imploded by fighting against each other, and the Tudors just kind of snuck right in. But they definitely didn't do their job in securing their throne, since the Plantagenets reigned for over 300 years and the Tudors had 118. They gave it a good shot. But I definitely believe that Elizabeth not naming her successor really messed with the future of England. Thanks for that question.
So anyone who wants can raise your hand if you want to ask your question verbally, or you can post it in the chat. And we have a couple in the chat here. Let me rearrange my screen so I can see things. Bree asked, I would love to know how much of an active role you think Edward VI played in his reign.
Oh. I have studied Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, since 2016 and have kind of looked at the inner workings of the Regency Council quite a bit. And from what I have seen, and I haven't necessarily studied Edward VI himself, but kind of what happened behind the scenes, what I have seen is that just ambitious men took charge. And in particular, his uncle Edward was definitely a driving force of getting what he wanted England to be. And then with other men behind him, like John Dudley, who agreed with him, I don't think Edward VI had much of a choice at that point. And because he was a minor, he really didn't have much power other than in title. I wish we could have seen what kind of ruler he would have been. It's interesting to me because a lot of people say he probably would have been a lot like Henry VIII. And I think it's hard to predict that because he was 15 when he died. So he was still so young. And so much of his life was sheltered too. I mean, at least Henry VIII had a little bit of a life before his brother Arthur died, and he got to not be an heir to the throne for that long. So yeah, I think that's an interesting question.
Got another Edward IV question. Were there any specific reasons you think that Edward IV had for thinking that Jane Grey would succeed him successfully?
I think they meant Edward VI, but that's okay. It's easy to switch.
Oh yeah.
I think the main reason for Edward choosing Jane Grey was to make England Protestant. I think he was very afraid of his sister Mary coming in and turning England back to Catholicism and to the Pope. I think that was a huge fear of his. And I would say a large portion of the Regency Council also did not want that. John Dudley clearly did not want that.
Yeah. Similar question. Did Henry really use his break from Rome as a contingency, or was it just a reaction to the Pope not backing him?
That's a good question. I guess it could be seen as both. You know, in my mind, it was his backup plan to figure out a way to get what he wanted. But it also gave him a lot of power too, didn't it? So I think it was one of those, I'm going to have this reaction and look at the benefits that I'm going to get from it. Henry definitely benefited being the head of the Church of England.
Yeah. And, confiscating all the wealth from the monasteries was not a bad side benefit of the whole thing.
Well, and after he spent all of his dad's money, his dad had built up his coffers so big, and young Henry came in and just started spending like crazy. He had to figure out a way to leave some money behind for his heirs too.
I would argue Henry VIII could be in our next panel.
Wouldn't that be entertaining?
So Roberto asks, why did Henry VIII never make it a point to name Henry Fitzroy as a legitimate son in the case of Edward VI's early death?
Yeah, I think it's just the scandal that would have went around having an illegitimate son. I think that also goes back to the Plantagenets. They could have done the same thing, but holy cow, you're just opening up another Wars of the Roses if things don't go right. If somebody else decides, well, he's illegitimate, they're going to be looking for somebody who they see as legitimate. And that's when all the fighting starts. And people are trying, people are getting murdered and wars are starting, all just so somebody in their family can have full reign of England. It was dangerous. It would have been extremely dangerous to name Fitzroy. That really would have been the last course of action he could have taken. He was still young enough, and how would they know that one day his daughter Mary would be queen regnant? I mean, that wasn't even a thought at the time.
Yeah, you have to go back to like the late Carolingian kingdom to find a European monarch who was okay with legitimizing a illegitimate child. So
Yeah, definitely.
did Queen Mary have any real plans to prevent Elizabeth from inheriting from her, given the difference in religious views?
That is a great question. And I honestly don't know enough about Mary's reign to be able to answer that question, but I know there's some amazing people out there right now who are doing a lot of groundbreaking research on Mary the First. In particular, Johanna Strong, Dr. Johanna Strong, who has been on the show and co-hosted before, and Peter Stiffel are both right now doing some amazing work on Mary the First. So I'd recommend finding them on social media, following them, and asking them some of these questions about her, because they're going to know, they're going to have the right answers for you.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. David says, oh, and that last one was from Noga F. So David says, there's contingency planning and then there's luck. What do you think Henry VIII would have done if he hadn't lucked into being in power at the same time that Protestantism had just laid out an alternative theory of power that he could glom onto?
Oh, alternative histories. I always try to stay away from alternative histories because they could go in so many different directions and we just don't know what he would have done. I mean, I don't know. What do you think he would have done, Ben?
That I was just thinking about that actually with the Henry Fitzroy question, because it's like, if Protestantism angle had been closed off, would that, if he's a guy who's willing to just blow up everything in favor of succession, maybe Henry Fitzroy would have been more of an option, but also maybe blowing everything up would have been less of an option. Would have just had to take his lumps like everyone else.
Right, exactly. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I just have such a hard time with alternative history, is that we just don't know. We can only make assumptions, but it didn't happen that way. Don't hate me for answering that way.
To refer to the Stuart, this is Robert J. May. To refer to the Stuarts again, isn't it interesting that neither Henry or Charles were their father's oldest sons? Both were never supposed to be king.
It is so interesting. And it seems like, we see that in history. When that happens, these young men who were the spares get thrust into this position of power, but they weren't trained for it. Yeah. And I think we can really tell with Henry VIII that he wasn't raised to be an heir, because he was kind of a wild child and a loose cannon. And it makes you wonder, if he had been raised as Arthur had been raised, would he have been a different king? We don't know. What kind of king would Arthur have been? We have no idea. Would he have been like his father, or would he have been just like Henry VIII?
Okay, that's just a chronological correction.
I just saw the comment about Henry being a loose cannon's an understatement. Isn't that true?
Lynn Marie Taylor noted that Henry Fitzroy died in July 1536, before the second act of succession was passed in Parliament, so he couldn't have been put into the line of succession as an alternative to Edward. So, yes,
very true.
How much did Elizabeth's avoidance of marrying to be overshadowed by a husband versus dangling herself? Okay, I'll creatively reinterpret this. So how much of Elizabeth's avoidance of marriage was fear of being overshadowed by her husband versus the attractiveness of using the marriage prospect to lure good behavior out of the Spanish and the French and the Holy Roman Empire?
I think Elizabeth was so intelligent. She was so smart. She knew how to play this game. I personally think that she did marry in secret and that she did have a secret love child, but we'll have to wait for the evidence to come out. I know there are some people researching this right now, and I think it's a fascinating story to see what maybe she was trying to do and to provide for England, and how she had to navigate the politics of court in creative ways to secure her reign. Really, when it comes down to it, it's tough when it comes to Elizabeth, because she did see what happened with her sister becoming queen regnant. She did see how the English folk were very concerned about Philip II of Spain being a king consort and what kind of power he would have, because in marriage back then, the husband, you had to obey him. And so Mary herself had to navigate that in an interesting way to be able to show, no, I am the ruler. So Elizabeth saw that. I'm sure that was a great influence on her. But I do feel like she would have done what she could have to have an heir, but she was also smart enough to know that she could play. It was like a game of chess.
Yeah.
She could play these men in these countries in ways that benefited her in the long run.
Yeah. The thing that just occurred to me is that also there was no one who was a Protestant monarch that was really her equal, which was always going to be a problem, I think. Like, the big powers were Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and France, who are all sort of by definition Catholic monarchs.
Right.
The only major state, I guess, that was Protestant at that point would be like the Netherlands, who are a republic. Not going there.
And not like they were a big powerhouse by comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also Sweden, but that's a whole kettle of fish. You don't want to get involved.
Let's not open that door today.
Let's do one more, because we're about 4 minutes from wrapping up. How do you think things would have been different if Arthur had not died?
Wow. Henry VIII wouldn't have married 6 times. Anne Boleyn probably would have lived a longer life, possibly. I guess we don't know there either. That's so hard to say, right? Because he was raised as an heir. His father was Henry VII. We saw how Henry VII ruled. I think, in my opinion, I think he would have ruled very similar to Henry VII, and he would not have been the loose cannon that his brother was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Great answer. Okay. Battle Royale podcast. So Ben, other Ben, says Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV of France, was Protestant and led a huge Protestant contingent in France. Just want to pop that in there. But Elizabeth was often seen as a figurehead too by French Protestants. Also, Henry converted to Catholicism later. Oops.
Well, not technically. I mean, I think, you know what, when it comes to Henry and religion, I think becoming the head of the Church of England was convenient for him, and that at heart, he was always a Catholic.
Yeah.
And I can only use my own experience. You know, I was raised in the Catholic Church, and that just formed a basis for me. You know, after being in that for so many years, it really helps. It makes you become who you are and the things that you believe. And no matter how sometimes you try to get away from it, it's still there. And I think that's how it was for Henry VIII, that even at the end when he was dying, I think he was afraid. He was afraid of all of the bad things that he had done, because you're going to go to hell when you're going to get stuck in purgatory, all of these things. I think he was terrified at the end that he'd be stuck in purgatory or end up in hell and not be this glorious king he thought he was.
Henry of Navarre is an interesting comparison to that, because he just didn't seem to care. He's the one who said Paris is well worth a mass.
Oh, he sounds like a great guy. Let's follow him.
Yeah. So we're a minute early, but I think rather than get involved in another question, let's wrap it up here. And Rebecca, thank you so much for a great presentation, and thanks everybody for your fantastic questions. This was a great way to kick off the whole thing. And up next, for everybody's edification, we've got the Histories Nudniks panel, Grand Dukes of the West, History of Valois Burgundy. We've got History of American Food, and Totalis Rankium. So we've got 4 great sessions to go to. Everyone, go have a great time.
Thanks, everyone, for coming here today. I really appreciate it.
Bye.